All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're reviewing the play of the Falcons. Wide receivers in 2021. We'll be talking about whether Calvin Ridley or Julio Jones was the bigger loss, Russell Gage's breakout 2021 season, as well as whether or not the Falcons can upgrade the position this offseason via the draft or free agency.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And of course, I want to thank everybody that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, also free and available on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel so that you can watch the episode a few hours earlier than when the audio version of the podcast goes live. Most nights, at least, probably not this episode because I'm recording this late Sunday evening, and so it'll go live on YouTube on Monday morning. But most other nights, the other 4 days a week, you'll get it, a few hours early the night before. So check out Locked On Falcons there. So today's episode, we are continuing our year-end positional reviews, this time looking at the wide receiver group, talking about sort of the big storylines, talk about sort of Calvin Ridley, Russell Gage, talk about Julio Jones, and we'll talk about the offseason moves. And I think when we talk about sort of the biggest storyline for this position group, I think we're talking about the losses of, receivers. And I don't like to be reductive on this podcast, meaning I don't like to sort of look at only one factor or one variable and act like that's the only thing that matters, because it's multiple things that matter. But, for the sake of argument today, I am going to be a little bit more reductive to sort of drive this initial point home. And I feel like if we're being reductive, when we can sit here and say, what was the biggest factor that was impacting why the Falcons offense was not nearly as effective this season as we thought it would be going into the season? And I think that was losing Julio Jones. I think it's easy to sort of look at Julio Jones's lack of production this past season with the Tennessee Titans and sort of dismiss that notion that I just put forward. But I think, measuring his potential impact to the Falcons offense based off of his potential or his actual impact to the Titans offense is a pretty flawed way of looking at it. And all you really have to do is look at how impactful Julio Jones has been for Matt Ryan, particularly over the last several years when Matt Ryan has had a first-time offensive play caller and we've seen Matt Ryan have some struggles, and I talked about this on the quarterback episode, but there is a tendency in those situations, whether we're talking about 2015 with Kyle Shanahan, 2017 with Steve Sarkisian, 2019 with Dirk Cutter, or this past year with Arthur Smith, is for Matt Ryan to tend to kind of focus on one guy because he's not necessarily confident or comfortable with the play calling in year one. And he kind of just basically forces the ball to the guy that he knows is going to get open, play call, be damned, or whatever the case may be. And not having Julio Jones had a major impact on why I think Matt Ryan was not particularly productive this year and had one of the worst seasons he's had based off of various statistical metrics. And I thought, throughout most of this season, he wanted that guy to be Kyle Pitts, but Kyle Pitts wasn't necessarily ready to step up into that role. And that's not a knock on Kyle Pitts. It's big shoes to fill. Julio Jones, potentially a first ballot Hall of Famer. You can't necessarily expect a guy to do that in year one. And then you probably sit there and say, well, no, Aaron, it wasn't Julio Jones. It was Calvin Ridley. Losing Calvin Ridley, midway through the season due to a mental health break that Ridley went on starting in week 8, you would argue, hey, that was the biggest factor, and that's what Matt Ryan was missing. Although I would disagree with that. I think theoretically, yes, losing Ridley is a devastating blow, because theoretically Ridley was the number one wide receiver, would be the guy that Matt Ryan would try to force the ball to in those situations. But that hasn't necessarily been the type of receiver that Calvin Ridley has been throughout his career, being that sort of guy that could win in those contested catch situations. And then when you look at the production that Calvin Ridley actually had in 2021 with Matt Ryan versus what the Falcons offense look like without him, you don't see a significant difference in the Falcons offense with and without Calvin Ridley. Like, for example, I've talked about this before. You compare what Calvin Ridley did down the stretch in 2020 in those final 6 or so games where Julio Jones was out of the lineup to what he did at the beginning of 2021. In the back end of 2020, Calvin Ridley on an individual level was averaging like 14, 15 yards per reception. But in his 5 games this past season, only was averaging 9 yards per reception. And then previously, I've compared that to basically the drop off between Stephon Diggs in a pre-2021 Russell Gage. And you look at Matt Ryan's adjusted net yards per attempt, or ANYA, with and without Ridley this past year. And adjusted net yards per attempt is really a good metric to measure overall quarterback and offensive efficiency. And with Ridley, it was 6.1. Without Ridley, it was 5.8, which is not significant. If you look at Matt Ryan's expected points added per play, was fairly insignificant with and without Ridley in terms of that difference. It was slightly better, but maybe would move him up one spot in the various rankings at the quarterback position. Now, I do think you can make a pretty good argument, or a better argument, that where Calvin Ridley's loss impacted this team was when it came to explosive plays. Not because Ridley himself was generating explosive plays, which was a beef I had with Arthur Smith. But when you look at how many explosive plays this offense in general was generating with and without Calvin Ridley, with Calvin Ridley, in terms of those 20 plus yard plays, the Falcons were averaging about 3.4 in those 5 games that Ridley played in. And in the 12 games without him, it was 2.4. Now, one big play per game may not seem that significant, but that's the difference between essentially being the 20th ranked offense in terms of explosive plays and being dead last in the NFL. And my personal vendetta, I guess you could call it, with Arthur Smith is due to the fact that when you look at that Cutter-led offense at the end of 2020 with Calvin Ridley and Hayden Hurst and Russell Gage, and without Julio Jones, looking at their explosiveness, they were like the 14th best offense, most explosive offense in those 6-game stretch. And then when you consider that you're adding Kyle Pitts and adding Cordero Patterson, and the fact that you went from 14th to 20th and you didn't improve on that, is part of the reason why, guys, I do not necessarily praise Arthur Smith to the degree that I think some other people praise him. But we're not going to talk about that on today's episode. But I think when it comes to those explosive plays, really what Calvin Ridley was providing was his presence on the football field was drawing attention away, or drawing attention to from the defense. And so that allowed guys like Kyle Pitts and Cordero Patterson, particularly in those early games where they had a number of big explosive plays, to get more of those one-on-one situations and take advantage of that. So that would be the argument I would make, that having Ridley on the field in terms of generating explosive plays was more valuable. And you guys know that I don't take that lightly, because I'm all about explosive plays being the key to success in this league. And so because of that reason, you will hear me say things like, I think the Falcons' best chance of putting their best foot forward offensively in 2022, due to that notion, is having Calvin Ridley back in the offense, is tied to Calvin Ridley returning in this upcoming season. And one of the arguments you can make against the point I've made about Calvin Ridley in terms of his impact on and off the field is that you can make the case that, I'm basing this off of a very small sample size. And that's similar to another player that, even though the difference in the offense early in the season with Ridley on the field and without Ridley later in the season wasn't significant, it could have been, at least theoretically. The potential was there for it to be a much more significant difference, because like Russell Gage, that other player that we're talking about, potentially Calvin Ridley could have been so much better in the second half of the season as Arthur Smith got more comfortable with knowing how to utilize him, as he seemed to do with Russell Gage. And Russell Gage, as well as the rest of the receiver group, is what we're going to get into as we continue today's Friday's Locked On Falcons 2021 wide receiver review. But before we get there, guys, of course, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen, but always have recommendations for your second listen, including the Locked On Braves podcast. Find out what the latest is going on with my cousin Freddie. Unfortunately, I don't have the insights into that, but go check out the Locked On Braves podcast, free and available on the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So it's a new year, which means people are coming up with new Year's resolutions. And if yours is about getting fit or eating healthier, Built Bar should be incorporated into your plan. Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar. You know, eating healthy can be boring. It can be not particularly fun, but Built Bar makes eating healthier fun. It makes it easier to stick to your resolution because Built Bars taste good, that you'll want to eat it. Even if you're not necessarily a huge fan of working out, you can at least eat something that tastes great and is good for you because Built Bars are low in sugar, carbs, and calories, as well as being high in protein and fiber. There's so many flavors to choose from. You got the tried and trues like coconut almond peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream. You got limited time flavors like coconut brownie chunk, as well as others. Check out what's available at built.com. And when you do, use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So Russell Gage also had an interesting season in addition to Calvin Ridley this past year. You look at his season, it was very up and down, particularly early on, had 0 catches in week 1. Then he got hurt in week 2, missed the next 3 games. Then he was held without catches again in weeks 8 and 10, that Dallas game. But after that point, Russell Gage really put it on. But up to through that Dallas game, you would have looked at Russell Gage's production and he would have been on pace at that point in the season to have only 37 catches, 371 yards, and only 2 touchdowns. But he actually finished with 67 catches, 770 yards, and 4 touchdowns. And so when you look at those final 8 games and extrapolate it for a full 17-game season, he was on pace to have over 100 catches, nearly 1,300 yards, and 6 touchdowns. And, that's production on par with Stephon Diggs. If you look at PFF's yards per route run metric, which is their wide receiver efficiency metric, over those final 8 games, Russell Gage ranked 10th in that metric among wide receivers, sandwiched in between none other than Deebo Samuel and Jamar Chase. So that doesn't mean, those stats don't necessarily mean that I actually think Russell Gage is on par with the Stephon Diggs, the Deebo Samuels, and the Jamar Chases. I'm only making that comparison because I do think people should recognize how well Russell Gage played in the second half of the season, which to certain Falcon fans will not be recognized because it doesn't fit the narrative that they were pushing all season long, which was, oh, Matt Ryan and this offense is bad because Matt Ryan has nobody to throw to. And people will just ignore the fact that Cordero Patterson, Kyle Pitts, and Russell Gage were all very productive in the second half of the season. If you really want to blame the Falcons' offensive struggles on anything, it's not the weapons that the Falcons had, it was the blocking that they had. But we'll get into that conversation, later this week. So I think when we look at Russell Gage's turnaround, again, going back to potentially maybe Calvin Ridley could have had a similar turnaround had he not stepped away from the football team in week 8 to deal with his mental health. And you sort of look at Russell Gage's turnaround, and you say, okay, what were the factors in why Russell Gage turned around? And the biggest factor is someone had to fill that Ridley size hole in the offense. So when we look at number one, why did Russell Gage produce like that in the second half? It's not necessarily due to profound skill set that Russell Gage suddenly tapped into. Is someone has to catch the football when the Falcons throw the football, and oftentimes that was going to be Russell Gage. If Calvin Ridley would have been, it would have often been Calvin Ridley. If Julio Jones had been there, it would have often been Julio Jones. If Mohamed Sanu had been there, occasionally it would have been Mohamed Sanu. But I think the second factor for why Russell Gage played so much better in the second half of the season was it did seem like, at least in my first pass of watching the film, and maybe it deserves a second pass as we get closer to free agency, as I continue to comb the depths of the film to really get a better picture of this team, but I haven't necessarily done that yet, is initially it seemed like the Falcons were more willing to use those sort of 3-by-1 sets and those bunch formations to create more complementary route combinations for a guy like Russell Gage, and giving him some of those free releases out of the slot and out wide for him to be more productive. But again, I'd have to give the film a second pass to really confirm that. But that was sort of my initial thought process. Unfortunately, even though that seemed to work for Russell Gage, it didn't quite work for Olamide Zaccheaus and Tajay Sharp. You saw a decent stretch of games, a 3-game stretch for Tajay Sharp from like week 5 to the week 8. And then you also saw some solid games from Olamide Zaccheaus sort of sprinkled in the second half of the season. But unfortunately, that wasn't consistent from either one of those guys. You essentially at their best, they were performing on par with what you would typically want from a third wide receiver, rather than someone that could consistently step up and be that number 2 that they were kind of being asked to be, with Ridley out of the lineup. And then you look at Frank Darby, who had little to no impact on the offense. He only ran a total of 12 routes in 3 games and caught 1 pass this entire season. And that shouldn't be a surprise. I know a lot of people look at Frank Darby's lack of production as a disappointment. I don't think that should be a huge surprise based off of your expectations, because if you had listened to what I had to say about Frank Darby in the scouting report that I did in the audio version in June, you can find a video version of it, or at least on YouTube, the audio version of it also on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. You heard me compare him to another player that was not particularly productive in the NFL, was Riley Ridley, of course, Calvin Ridley's younger brother. But Riley Ridley was like a 4th-round pick of the Bears in 2019. It did not produce particularly a lot as a rookie. And I talked about, Darby was one of those guys that, like Riley Ridley, and as I kind of predicted back in June when I talked about Frank Darby and Riley Ridley, Ridley would be out of the league. He got cut by the Bears this past summer and hasn't caught on with another team, and may not get another opportunity in the NFL. And I basically said Ridley's downfall was he didn't necessarily have great separation skills and great speed and all these various things, and he also couldn't produce on special teams. And the key for Frank Darby was not necessarily my expectations that he would come in and be significantly better on offense than Riley Ridley was, that he would have to catch on in special teams. And I think Frank Darby did that. That is going to potentially buy him further opportunities that Riley Ridley never got. And so, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Frank Darby was great on special teams, but I thought he did enough as a gunner on the punt team that he should buy himself a couple more bites at the apple, a couple more at bats in the future, so that he will have the time to develop and maybe become more than what he was this past season. You look at the Falcons' other wide receiver. Again, I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath on Frank Darby becoming a fixture in the Falcons' offense, because ultimately, I kind of think the best bet. I think his ceiling is probably higher than this, but more than likely you'll probably see Frank Darby, not outperform what we've seen from Christian Blake over the years. That's kind of a similar skill set that I think Frank Darby has. And of course, Christian Blake didn't really contribute much this past year. Now, here's the problem the Falcons face with their wide receiver core is all of those guys, for the most part, are free agents. Russell Gage and Tajay Sharp are unrestricted free agents. Olamide Zaccheaus and Christian Blake are restricted free agents that, there seems to be a pretty good probability that they won't get tendered and might wind up becoming unrestricted as well, which means that Calvin Ridley, Frank Darby are the only 2 players on the Falcons roster that are on the roster heading into 2022, if you don't count the 2 practice squad guys in Austin Trammell and Chad Hansen. So I think, depending on who you talk to, the notion that Calvin Ridley is a Falcon, kind of fluctuates, right? There's a possibility that Calvin Ridley gets traded this offseason. And again, depending on who you talk to, some people might say it's even a probability that he's going to get traded to. So you're going to have less talent at the wide receiver position potentially heading into the offseason, which means it's likely going to be a position of emphasis this offseason in free agency and the draft. However, what we're going to wrap up today's episode is I don't necessarily know if free agency and the draft are going to be as lucrative an avenue for the Falcons to address this position as maybe some people hope. And we'll get into exactly why that is as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And, somebody's going to be headed on the road. It's not going to be Locked On Falcons, but it's going to be Peacock and Williamson, the NFL show featuring Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson are heading on the road. They're heading to LA next month for Super Week. So go check out the Peacock and Williamson NFL show today to get the most comprehensive coverage of not only that game, but all the games and all the news in the lead up to the big game. And of course, Peacock and Williamson is free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. But speaking on going on to the road, I know many of you wind up, spending a lot of money on gas whenever you hit the road. But now you can save money every time you visit the pump with a new app called GetUpside. Every time when you use the free GetUpside app, you get 25 cents back per gallon every time you fill up. No, there is not a catch. GetUpside is a free app that you can download on the App Store or on Google Play. And all you got to do is open up the app, go to one of the thousands upon thousands of gas stations in your area to see which gas stations are eligible. You just head over there, you hit like two buttons on the app, and you basically get cash back up to 25 cents back per gallon on your Get Upside account that you can then use to deposit directly into your bank account, into your PayPal account. I like to use them for Amazon gift cards. And now when you use Get Upside, you can use our special promo code touchdown and you'll get a bonus 25 cents back on your first fill up. That's up to 50 cents back per gallon. So download the Get Upside app, use our special promo code touchdown when you sign up. That's Get Upside promo code touchdown to start saving every time you fill up. So obviously, the biggest factor for the Falcons moving forward this offseason at the wide receiver that's going to be the biggest question mark entering the offseason is whether or not Calvin Ridley gets traded. And as I've said a number of times over the last month or two, I don't know if that's going to happen. If you listen to what Steve Weish and Mike Garafolo are saying about it, they're predicting that Calvin Ridley has played his last games in Atlanta. I have no reason to doubt those folks. I have no reason to sit here and tell you that those people are predicting the future. It's sort of up in the air, but I'm sort of, it seems like we're heading in that direction, that Calvin really is not going to be an Atlanta Falcon. And then obviously the question after that, if that's the case, then what do the Falcons get back for him? And I don't know that answer either, guys. I'm not as optimistic as others that the Falcons are definitely going to get a first round pick. I don't know if teams are going to offer the Falcons a first round pick. In general, I'm a glass half empty type of person. But I generally tend to be pessimistic about these things because you don't necessarily get what you think a player is worth on the trade market. You usually get a little bit less than that. So my assumption is not a first round pick, but probably a day 2 pick. We'll just sort of see if the Falcons can get more than that. You saw the rumblings from Jeremy Fowler last week on ESPN, where he talked to NFL executives and basically asked them what his market could be. And one of those executives answered a conditional second. So it was a second round pick that could turn into a first round pick based off of Ridley's performance. But presumably that's Ridley's performance in the upcoming 2022 season. So you're not going to get that in the 2022 draft. It's going to be the 2023 draft. So presumably in the 2022 draft, if that's the case, and you're possibly getting a first or second round pick in the 2023 draft, then you're probably getting less than that in the 2022 draft, is sort of my inference of that. But again, I don't know. So we'll just sort of have to see how that goes. Again, it's all speculation at this point in time. But from my perspective, it seems to be more wishful thinking than anything, in terms of people hoping and expecting the Falcons get a first round pick via trade for Calvin Ridley. But again, you can probably take that with a grain of salt, because I also thought it was wishful thinking and Falcon fans being, off their rockers when they were suggesting that the Falcons would get anything more than the 4th round pick 2 years ago when they traded Mohamed Sanu. So again, what do I know? So we can obviously get deeper into that conversation, but there's not just a whole lot to say because there's nothing really concrete. We're just speculating at this point in time. And so until we get something a little bit more substantial to chew on, beyond sort of the educated guesses of NFL Network employees, we'll just sort of leave that aside and talk about it at a later date when we get more substantial information. But let's say you're losing Calvin Ridley, that means you're going to need to get a wide receiver 1, or I guess technically a wide receiver 2, because Kyle Pitts is going to be your wide receiver 1. And no, I don't mean that because Kyle Pitts is a wide receiver masquerading as a tight end. The WR versus TE designation beside his name is inconsequential to that conversation. I'm talking about a receiver 1, 2, or 3, based off of your role in the offense, which can typically be measured by a wide receiver 1 or receiver 1 gets 8 to 12 targets per game. number 2 gets 5 to 8 targets per game, and number 3 gets 3 to 5, and a number 4 gets 1 or 2 targets per game. And when you look at this roster, particularly in a post Calvin Ridley universe, Kyle Pitts is the most likely player to fill that number 1 receiver niche of getting those 8 to 12 targets per game. If you look at Russell Gage's production this past year, he over the course of the season and in the second half of the season, his targets were more as a high end number 2. Now, I think most of us would agree, despite Russell Gage producing at that level, he's probably ideally suited to be more of that number 3 guy that he was prior to that, where he's getting about 3 to 5 targets a game versus 5 to 8 targets a game. So in that case, if you're able to retain Russell Gage as well as Kyle Pitts, and you lose Calvin Ridley, then you probably at the very least need someone that can come in and give you 5 to 8 targets a game. So what I will say, though, is if you do wind up trading Calvin Ridley, I think that does dramatically increase the odds that you do wind up retaining Russell Gage. I feel like, his ability to stay in Atlanta in 2022 is going to be based off of price tag. That's going to be the case for a number of free agents that are about to hit potentially the open market this offseason across this Falcons roster. I think probably ideally you're looking at like a $5 to $8 million a year range for Russell Gage. If you can get him in that spot, I think that's a good deal to keep Russell Gage. Anything more than that, I think you're probably pushing it a little bit. And I think a lot of that is based off his production, not only in the second half of the season, but also in previous years as well. I think he's certainly earned a contract in that sort of range. Now, I'm sure many of you are hearing that number and say, oh, man, we can do way better than Russell Gage. He ain't worth that, blah, 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 blah. And look at all the free agents that are about to hit the open market. And there's a lot of big name free agent wide receivers that could potentially hit the market. You have Devontae Adams, of course, but he may get tagged. But other guys like Allen Robinson, Chris Godwin, Mike Williams, Michael Gallup are other names that potentially are free agents that are not expected to get tagged based off of what I'm hearing. You also have Odell Beckham and Antonio Brown. I don't think those guys can necessarily be on the Falcons' radar, but certainly they're going to be some big names on the open market. But before you get too enamored with the Falcons adding one of those big name free agents, I would warn you, I don't think it's likely because I think the cost to signing those guys is probably going to be out of the Falcons' price range. And B, even if you're sitting there saying, well, Godwin and Gallup aren't going to cost that much because you'll get a discount because they got hurt at the end of the season. But I think the fact that they got hurt at the end of the season makes it unlikely that the Falcons will pursue those guys, because the timetable typically for recovering from ACL tears is about 9 months, which means if you got hurt in late December and early January, like those two guys did, you're probably not going to be returning to practice until September. So once the season has started, and so you're not going to be able to practice until in-season practices. And we know with Matt Ryan, historically, it takes the better part of, a season for him to get on the same page with his receivers. And again, you're not going to have any of the offseason for that to sort of get going. So when are you going to get impact from Godwin and Gallup types? November, December at the earliest. So I don't see why you would be particularly enamored with signing those guys, at least in terms of hoping that they would provide you short-term value in 2022. If you're signing those guys, you're really signing them for 2023 and 2024. And then in that situation, you're probably not getting cheap deals, because those guys, you would have to pay full price to sign them to multi-year contracts. So I say that, and I also would add that in general, there is a buyer's beware to signing free agent wide receivers. When you look at the past decade of the impactful wide receiver additions and acquisitions, they typically are trades, not free agent signings. One of the things I did before this episode to do some research went all the way back to 2016 when we signed Mohamed Sanu, and looked at all the wide receivers that signed with a new team, and so not guys that re-signed with their old team, that for contracts that lasted at least 2 years and were averaging at least $6 million a year. And I chose that figure because Sanu got basically $6.5 million a year on the contract he got from the Falcons. So I basically said $6 million or above. So guys that made comparable money to Mohamed Sanu or more. And then looked at their production in the first 2 seasons that they had with their respective team, mainly focusing on that year one production to sort of see what we could get out of those guys immediately in 2022. And certainly you can make the case that maybe I should also look at the 1 year contracts. I should also look at guys that sign for $3, $4, $5 million a year. And at a later date, as we get closer to free agency, I may wind up doing that to sort of see if that provides a little bit better bang for your buck. But I have a graphic showing you that information on the research I did. So this is just another reason to subscribe to the illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast here on YouTube so that you can see these graphics. But on your screen, you have 29 receivers over the past 6 off seasons that met that criteria. Hopefully you guys can see it. If you're looking at this on your phone, I apologize. You might have to blow this image up on your desktop or on your television if you're watching it on YouTube. But when you look at this, they're ordered by how many yards they had in year one. And there was only 2 guys that are 1,000-yard receivers that, signed these contracts and had 1,000 yards in their first year with their new teams. That was Robbie Anderson in 2020 with the Panthers and John Brown in 2019 with the Bills. On average, when you look at these 29 players, or when you look at their median targets in production, they had about 80 targets, 50 catches, 650 or so yards, and about 3 touchdowns. That was sort of the median, and the average is slightly below that. Now you compare that to what Russell Gage just gave us this past year, which was 94 targets, 66 catches, 770 yards, and 4 touchdowns. And so if you set Russell Gage's numbers as your new benchmarks, you only see a handful of guys that reach those benchmarks. If you're looking at the graphic on YouTube, the guys that that match Russell Gage, their numbers are highlighted in yellow. The guys that exceeded Gage in these various metrics and targets, receiving, yards, and touchdowns are highlighted in green. And pretty much in all the categories, you're looking at a half dozen, about 7 guys in each category that outproduced Russell Gage in any of these 4 areas. And when you look at guys that outproduce Russell Gage in all 4 areas, targets, catches, yards, and touchdowns, it's only really a handful of guys. It's John Brown, his 2019 teammate Cole Beasley in Buffalo, Marvin Jones in 2021 with the Jaguars. You also have Jamison Crowder in 2019 with the Jets. You could potentially throw Robbie Anderson because he had more targets, receptions, and yards, and 1 less touchdown than Gage. And you could even throw in Robert Woods with the 2017 Rams, who had less targets and receptions, but more yards and more touchdowns. So you're still only looking at like 6 or 7 guys at most out of 29 that in their first year exceeded what Russell Gage gave the Falcons this past year. So you're looking at basically a 20 to 25% hit rate among these 29 free agents that came in year one and outproduced what the Falcons just got out of Russell Gage. And when you look at the numbers in year 2, you're not seeing a dramatic increase in the number of players in year 2. So basically what this is telling you, that free agent is not an avenue to think in most years to think that you're going to get a significant upgrade over what Russell Gage provided you. And then when you look at the 6 or 7 guys that we're talking about in terms of how much money they made, and one of the figures that you look on the right side of this column is average or dollars per yard. And basically I took their annual per year average and divided it by how many yards they got to sort of basically look at how much guys were getting paid. And across the 29 or so guys, that was about $30,000 per yard, but that was inflated somewhat by Curtis Samuel's disastrous 2021 year with the Redskins, where he got paid over $11 million per year and only had 27 yards this year. If you look at the median, it was 16.5 thousand. So when you look at the 6 guys that outproduced Gage, on average, it was about $9,000 per yard that they produced. So when I look at Gage's numbers and I say, okay, he had 770 yards, $9,000 per yard, that would be about $7 million per year. So that's where you got that previous figure of like $5 to $8 million. To me is a good range, a good price tag for Russell Gage in terms of a bargain. Anything more than $8 million, I feel like you're stretching it based off of his production. And so basically if you're paying Russell Gage $7 million or less, and he's still giving you production like you've gotten these last 2 years of 770 yards and 786 in 2020, to me, you're getting a pretty good deal in far as that regard. But if you look at the average, again, that 16,500 figure, the median number, that would mean based off of Russell Gage's production, you would have to pay a guy nearly $13 million a year on average for your typical free agent to get comparable production to Russell Gage. And that to me is essentially a non-starter. So we will end the graphic there for you guys. Obviously, you can go back and pause the video if you want to get a deeper look at it. So for me, when I look at those numbers, I'm basically seeing a strategy where, re-signing Russell Gage seems to be a very good bet for the Falcons. And probably rather than going out there and splurging in free agency on a free agent wide receiver, you re-sign Russell Gage, and then hopefully you can fill the void in the draft with a rookie. But then again, drafting a rookie is not necessarily a great strategy. Maybe you hit on the T. Higgins, maybe you hit on a Chase Claypool on day 2 or something like that, that can come in and right away and be productive for you. But drafting a wide receiver is not a great bet either, because if you're looking for that true number one guy that can give you 8 to 12 targets a game. So if we're looking at guys over the last couple of seasons that have had 120 plus targets in their rookie seasons, the only 3 guys that have done that are Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, and Jalen Waddle. Again, I don't think it's likely that you're going to find another guy like that in this upcoming draft. I haven't seen a guy so far that I would put on those guys' level quite yet. And then even if you lowered the threshold from 120 targets to 94 targets, in terms of what guys can do as a rookie in the league, which is what Russell Gage had, 94 targets this past year. Since 2016, 13 rookie receivers have done it. 10 of them have done it in the last 2 years. So maybe that's an indicator that it's easier to get done, or maybe that's just an indicator that the last 2 drafts were much better at the wide receiver position than people thought they would be. But of those 13 rookies that have done that have exceeded 94 targets, 6 of them were first round picks, 5 of them were second round picks. So that's 11 guys taken in the first 2 rounds. That's a solid number. But then when you factor in that 53 wide receivers have been drafted over the last 6 drafts in the first 2 rounds, that's basically a 20% hit rate. So essentially what this is telling me, all of this is to sit here and say that over the next couple of months, you're going to hear me basically say things like, I think the best additions the Falcons can make this offseason at the wide receiver is not subtracting Calvin Ridley and Russell Gage. That I really do think those guys are going to give you more bang for your buck in 2022 at the wide receiver position than probably anybody that the Falcons will wind up adding, whether that's a free agent or a draft. That's not me saying that the Falcons shouldn't sign somebody in free agency. That's not me saying the Falcons shouldn't draft guys. But I'm sitting here saying that if you're looking for that number 1 wide receiver, that number 2 wide receiver, or in our case, if Kyle Pitts is our number 1, then you're looking for the number 2 and number 3 guys to give you those 8 plus or 8 targets and 5 targets a game. Then I think Russell Gage and Calvin Ridley are your best bets to be those guys. And if you're signing guys in free agency, you're signing guys knowing that you're probably not going to get that level of production that you got from Russell Gage this past year, nor the level of production that you think you're going to get from Calvin Ridley if he's back and mentally ready to play football at the high level that we know he's capable of doing, as well as, if you draft a guy. So again, not saying that the Falcons shouldn't be looking to add players, because again, if they wind up losing some of these guys, they're going to have to find options in the draft and free agency, whether we're talking about Ridley, whether we're talking about Gage, Zacchaeus, Tajay Sharp, Christian Blake as well. They're going to need bodies at that position. So I'm not anti-adding players at the receiver position, but I just think if you're sitting here thinking, oh, we can easily upgrade Ridley, we can easily upgrade Gage in free agency in the draft, I think you have another thing coming. Now, maybe the Falcons are the team that's the outlier that has the 20% hit rate that we're talking about in free agency or in draft in terms of getting that year 1 impact. But I think the odds are probably more likely that they'll be 80%. But again, I'm a glass half empty type of guy. So maybe you guys disagree with me on that. So we'll just sort of have to see how that goes with this regime and whatnot. So that's going to do it for us, guys. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more to talk about as this offseason unfolds with Ridley and Gage and whatnot, and we can dig deeper in the numbers, particularly once we get into February and March, and we can really start to focus on free agency. And I'll probably have some updated graphics for you guys on some of the things that we talked about. But that's where we're going to do it and leave the conversation with the wide receiver group. Hopefully, the Falcons can add more bodies, but we'll just sort of have to see if they are the team that's drafting and signing the right guys, as opposed to the what the rest of the league is, and kind of whiffing on those guys, at least in year 1. Now, the last thing I'll say this. Now, if you're sitting here saying this, Aaron, but you're only talking about 2022, what about future years? And I would say, yeah, that's a valid point. If we're talking about maximizing what this team is going to add to the roster in 2022, I don't know if the draft and free agency are you going to be your best bet. Now, they're going to probably add more to you in 2023, 2024, and beyond. And that's not a problem. But again, getting back to the point we've made time and time again, are you trying to get the most out of Matt Ryan, what remaining years Matt Ryan has, and trying to maximize however much time, that ticking clock in terms of Matt Ryan's time here in Atlanta? Are you trying to maximize that? Because I don't know, I'm saying basically Ridley and Gage are your best bets there. But if you don't care about maximizing the time remaining for Matt Ryan and you're just basically he's a bridge quarterback, and if he sinks or swim, who cares? It's all about building towards the future. Then free agency and the draft may be better pathways for the Falcons moving forward. So that's the last point I'll leave on that front. We got it. We got, I don't think we're throwing Matt Ryan under the bus, but I'm just sitting here saying, like, that's the dilemma that the Falcons are going to be in. Moving forward at this position. And of course, if they wind up using, early round picks on a wide receiver, that's picks on that they can't use on other positions of need. So that's also the dilemma that you've heard me talk about quite a bit on this podcast over the last several months. So that's where we're going to leave it, guys. Probably tomorrow we'll be talking tight end positions. Hopefully we'll have a guest on Wednesday. We might have to reshuffle the schedule if things change, but that's the plan right now. We'll get into Kyle Pitts. We'll get into Lee Smith. We'll get into Hayden Hurst, Jaden Graham, and Parker Hesse, of course, the incomparable Parker Hesse on tomorrow's episode when we do the year in review of the tight end position and talk all about Kyle Pitts and the hopes and dreams. I might sound pessimistic about this wide receiver group, but I'm much more optimistic about that tight end group moving forward. So we'll get into that on tomorrow's episode. If you guys have any feedback that you want to provide on anything I discussed on today's episode, if you want to sit here and send me angry emails being like, Aaron, you got to use a bigger font on these graphics, man, I can't see any of this stuff, then by all means hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send that angry email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and say, man, that font is terrible. You got to get bigger than, I think I was like using 11 font. You got to get 18 or something, Aaron. You're killing us with these graphics. So let me know all about that, guys, and provide that feedback. But I appreciate it. And we'll get into all of that in future episodes. And in the meantime, why not check out the Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, and Locked On Bulldogs as your second listen, as well as a Locked On Bets podcast where handicapping expert Lee Sterling is giving you his daily picks, his blowout specials, and of course his lock of the day each and every day on the Locked On Bets podcast, free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. Appreciate it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the divisional round weekend. Some great games there. Don't have any comments other than just like, hey, man, football's fun. This is what football is all about. And unfortunately, we're all stuck watching the Falcons rather than some of these great teams that we got to see this weekend. Hopefully the Falcons will get there one day and we will be able to have the entertainment that, Bills fans and Chiefs fans and 49ers and Packers and Rams fans. Of course, my Rams are still on the path to Super Bowl success, but we'll see all about that. They're playing a home game in a couple of weeks. So all of that can be covered. Of course, you can check it out on the Peacock and Williamson podcast. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this weekend. I hope you have a great week. Till then.